Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about number methods in Python. Numbers are everywhere in programming, and Python has different types of numbers that we need to understand. By the end of today's lesson, you'll know the difference between integers and floats, how to convert between them, and some useful things we can do with numbers. So, let's start with the two main types of numbers in Python. First, we have integers. These are whole numbers, which means they don't have any decimal points. Examples of integers are 1, 2, -3, and 1000. In Python, you'd write them as 1, 2, -3, and 1000. Then we have floats, which are numbers that do include decimal points. So examples of floats would be 1.0, 2.5, -3.5, or even 0.01. In Python, you'd write them as 1.0, 2.5, -3.5, and 0.01. Here's an interesting thing about floats. In Python, you can also write really big numbers using something called scientific notation. If you write 3.5 E3, that actually means 3.5 times 1000, which is 3500. Now let's talk about converting between these different types of numbers. Python has built-in functions that let us switch between integers, floats, and even strings. If we want to turn a float into an integer, we use the integer function. If we want to turn an integer into a float, we use the float function. And if we want to turn a number into a string, we use the string function. For example, if we write integer, 3.5, Python will remove the decimal part and just return 3. But notice that Python doesn't round. It just cuts off everything after the decimal. On the other hand, if we write float 3, Python will turn it into 3.0. So it's still the same number, but now Python knows it's a float. And here's something interesting. What happens if you add an integer and a float together? Well, Python automatically converts the result into a float. So if we add integer, 3.5, which becomes 3, and then add float, 3, which is 3.0, Python gives us 6.0 instead of just 6, because one of the numbers is a float. Now what if we convert numbers into strings instead? If we write string, 3, plus string, 3.5, instead of adding the numbers mathematically, Python will treat them as text and stick them together. So instead of 6.5, we'd actually get the string 33.5. That's because Python sees them as words instead of numbers. Now here's something really important. When we use the input function to ask the user for a number, Python always treats it as a string. So even if the user enters 100, Python doesn't see it as a number. It sees it as string text, 100. If we want to do math with that input, we need to convert it first. We can use integer if we need an integer, or float if we need a decimal. For example, if we ask the user to enter a number, we might store it like this: input number equals input. But to actually use it in a calculation, we'd write my number equals integer, input number. That way, Python will treat it like a real number. Now let's try some practice exercises. First, let's convert some numbers. Try converting the float 3.5 into an integer using integer 3.5 and see if it gives you 3. Then, convert the integer 3 into a float using float 3 and check if it gives you 3.0. Now try adding integer 3.5 and float 3 together and see what the result is. And finally, concatenate string 3 and string 3.5 and see what happens. Now let's try something more practical. Imagine you're buying gasoline. Let's assign 5.5 to a variable called gas liter, which represents the amount of gas we want to buy. Let's also assign 3 to a variable called price per liter, which is the price per liter of gas. Now we create a new variable called sum price and calculate the total price by multiplying gas liter by price per liter. If we print the total price as an integer using integer, we get 16. But if we print the same price as a float using float, we get 16.5. Now let's try a different example. Let's say we're buying apples. We'll assign 10 to apple count, meaning we're buying 10 apples. We'll assign 3 to price apple, meaning each apple costs $3. Now we multiply apple count by price apple and print the result. But what if we want to allow for fractional apples? Let's say we can buy 5.5 apples. We assign 5.5 to apple count and keep price apple at 3. Now we multiply those together and print the result. So today we learned that Python has two main types of numbers: integers, which are whole numbers, and floats, which include decimal points. We also learned how to convert between these types using integer, float, and string. And finally, we learned how to work with numbers in real-world examples, like buying gas or apples. That's it for today's lesson. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.